Okay, so do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Sally Davis and Mrs. Bartlett's asked me to talk to you today about magazine publishing. I worked in magazine publishing in London for about 10 years and that's in consumer magazines and business magazines. We can talk a bit more about what the difference is if you like in a minute. And now I have moved on to work at a company that you may have heard of, Amazon. It's just a small company. Where should we start?
Well, shall I just ask you to elaborate on what you said there about the different type of magazine?
Yes, so magazines generally fall into two groups. They're either consumer titles, which tend to be lifestyle magazines or, hobby type magazines, special interest magazines, that kind of thing. And they are normally either available in a shop, like a newsagent's or a bookshop or whatever, or available on subscription. And then there are business magazines, which have a slightly different audience, as you can imagine. They tend to be either direct business to business magazines, so that means that a company would buy a whole bulk load of these magazines and give them out at their company, or they might be available on the newsstand, but generally would tend to be subscription based, as I say, or bulk purchase based. So that's the kind of main difference in terms of distribution. And in terms of content, of course, it's because, one of them's lifestyle and the other one's more about kind of how to be better at business.
That's lovely, thank you. So in that case, I'll probably launch straight in with one of the things that we need to know about for our studies, which is, if you can, could you try and explain the process of sort of magazine from, each time it's time to make a new edition?
Yes, I could talk about this for a long time. It's a complicated process. So I'll try and keep it short. So, okay, basically with magazine planning and publishing, you kind of start at the end. So all magazines that exist today, at some point or other, decided the first thing was, when do we want our readers to get this magazine? And so you start at the end, you work backwards from there. So you would decide, okay, let's say we're producing a December issue, we want to do monthly issues. That means, we need to decide, when do we want our readers to get the December issue? And one of the interesting things you'll see about consumer magazines is that they actually tend to distribute their issues of the magazine quite a way ahead of the actual cover date. So the December issue, for example, you might receive as a reader at the end of September even, or potentially in October. And that might seem a little bit nuts. The reason that consumer magazines in particular do that, lifestyle magazines, is kind of based mostly on longevity. So if you think about it, let's bring it to life. If you've got a December issue and you give that to your readers and it lands on their doorsteps on the 1st of December and it's all about Christmas-based things or something like that, what's the likely longevity of that magazine? How long is a reader likely to read that for before they put it to one side and want something else? Well, they might come back to that magazine over the period of the month, but that's probably it. They're not going to want to read about Christmas stuff in January. So you are limiting immediately the lifespan of that magazine by distributing it at the first of the month, because that's only really going to be relevant for a month. If you distribute it at the end of October, let's say, you're giving yourself at least 2 months, right, for readers to be able to read that magazine and come back to it. And so that's what magazines are trying to do when they produce their issues a lot further ahead of the actual cover date. The reason it matters most to consumer magazines is because they tend to charge a lot more for advertising. So the other thing is that by having your readers come back to that magazine regularly through a longer period of time, you're more likely to see a better response rate from your adverts, and the advertisers themselves are more likely to see, therefore, more value for money of what they've paid for their advertising. So there you go. So there's a lot behind all of these decisions, and that's one of the most important things, longevity. The second one, I guess, is also about relevance. So you would need to decide, if, for example, you're producing a magazine that has quite a lot of news content in it, if you're producing that 2 months ahead of the cover issue, do you want people reading that in December when actually that news is going to be 2 months out of date, and you're going to seem like a slightly weird, out of sync magazine if you're talking about stuff that happened 2 months ago in a December issue? So there's things like that that also come into play, and that's why some monthly magazines, particularly business titles, who want to seem very relevant to what's happening in the business world, particularly if you're talking about listed companies where things can change on the stock market and all the rest of it, there's no point producing an issue 2 months ahead. That would be ridiculous. So it's kind of longevity and relevance together.
Yeah, because our students are going to be studying the Big Issue as one of their set products. Now, obviously, quite a lot of what goes in the Big Issue is contemporary news affairs. So that's, I think, a fortnightly magazine. So yeah, that doesn't really have the longevity that the glossy Vogue magazine that they also study with has. Yeah, thank you.
Exactly. So it's those two things really. So that's your big decision. When do you want your readers to get it? Once you've decided that, you work back from that. So you now have to look at all the different stages that get it to that point where it lands on their doorstep if it's coming in the post, or that it lands on the shelves in WH Smith's or whatever. So the kind of next step backwards is, how long does it take to distribute that magazine? So we talked about, you know, is it a subscription-based magazine? So that means you've got to factor in how long it takes to post it, is it going by courier or mail, whatever, and how long it takes to prep for the post. So you've got to wrap every single magazine. If you're printing thousands and thousands, you know, maybe hundreds of thousands of copies, you're going to need to prep that. So it'll need to be, by the people who do that, it'll need to be put into envelopes, it'll need to be wrapped in poly wrap, etc. There is machinery that can do that quite quickly at the printers, so it doesn't have to go somewhere else. But still, you've got to factor in time for that. So that might be a day, that might be 2 or 3 days even, depending on how many issues you have. You've also, as I mentioned, if it's a newsstand magazine, got to factor in being able to send those physical copies to then your newsstand distributor, who's like a third party, that then distributes that out to all the different branches of WH Smith's or wherever it is. You know, that's a huge distribution piece of organisation. So you normally, as a publisher, pay a third party distributor to worry about that, but you've got to factor that in as well. It might take a few days for their distribution network to get it out. So work backwards. So let's say then, you know, 3 days, maybe 4 days even, to prep for distribution. Then from that point, obviously you need to have printed it before it can be distributed. So how long does it, working backwards, take from the moment that you send the completed files, and these days everything's sent digitally, to the printers? How long does it take from them to then print it, ready to then be distributed? Normally, and there's no real normally because there's so many variables, but it's about 3 days to a week, depending on the size of the magazine, you know, the number of pages, the complexity of the pages. Have you got some thicker pages? Have you got lots of inserts? Have you got cover mounts? So that's things stuck to the front of the magazine, like freebie sort of gifts and stuff. How is it being bound? So depending on the different type of binding, that takes different length of time, and also how many copies of it you're also printing. So there's a lot of variables about the printing. I know, right?
So much going on, yeah.
It's almost like
for them
when it comes to how long does it take to print a magazine. So I've got a couple of issues here actually that I was editor for, if it helps. So to compare, so this is one magazine that I was editor of, Business Franchise, quite a nice cover there, an article about Levi jeans that I did, and this one is perfect bound. So that means, can you see it's flat along the edge here, and all the pages are stuck in with glue. And that is also a 196 page magazine, this one. So that is a hefty magazine, and the gluing and everything takes a lot of time. We also have in there certain extra special pages. So we've got one that's a double thickness and it folds out. Can you see this? So there's a whole bunch of like groovy things that can happen, and that would therefore take longer to print than, say, here's the next one I could give you. This one, Grad Jobs magazine. So once you're a graduate, you might become familiar with this one. To help you get a job.
Hint, hint, students, hint, hint.
Exactly. So you probably will. This is like, you know, Britain's most popular graduate magazine, and it lists job applications and everything else and so forth. This one, much more straightforward to print, all the same type of paper, all the same size, and the binding is a very straightforward saddle stitch, they call it, or saddle bound. So they're the main two types of binding for a magazine. Perfect bound, which is where the pages are all folded and glued down the edge, or this one where you've got, you know, the classic staples in the middle or stitching along the inside. So that's
great that you've shown us both of those, because the saddle one is Big Issue, and did you call it Perfect?
Perfect bound, yeah.
That's what Vogue is, I believe.
Yes,
although I don't know how Vogue in 1965 was bound, because actually it's a historical edition. So maybe that's something, guys, that's your independent research. You can go and find out.
Most consumer magazines, in fact, I can't think of consumer magazine it isn't. So I would say probably 99% of consumer magazines like Vogue are perfect bound, and it's much more rigid. As you can imagine with saddle stitch, you can sometimes tear a page out and accidentally, and it's not as robust. Whereas this, it's got a lot of glue there holding the pages together, and so they tend not to fall out ever, and they're quite difficult to rip out as well. So, and that's really good for another reason, which I should factor in as well, to the production of a magazine. If you have got lots of different thickness of pages and things like that, your printer, when printing them, has got to think about how to make that work with the other page that's opposite it. If you're in a saddle stitch situation, let me get a piece of paper to demonstrate. Well, it's okay, you can visualize. So every single page, if you think about it, is a folded piece of paper that then is stitched down the middle. So that means this page here at the front is the other half of the same piece of paper that's at the back, right? That's the problem with saddle stitch. If I want to have this piece as a thick bit, then this bit here's got to be thick as well, because they're joined together, right? Yep. However, perfect bound, you can get away with whatever you want. You can put in one thick piece of paper and just shove it in the middle, and as long as you're gluing it well with the perfect bound stitch, then you'll be fine. The perfect bound glue, you'll be fine, it'll stay in. So this gives you way more flexibility, and that's why most consumer magazines, and in fact the majority of business magazines these days, are perfect bound. So all of those go into how long it takes to actually print a magazine, and this is just the first stages, guys.
I was just thinking I might need to speed you along a little, if that's
okay. The next thing to think about it is, what date do we want to send the magazine to the printers, and then we work back from that and we produce our production schedule based on, okay, we've got to have everything ready by that date, and we send the finished documents, and they're normally PDF files because it embeds all the fonts in and everything and all the images and so on. And you send those PDF files to the printer. So you've got to get that date, you've got to hit that date. A lot of the time you get fined by the printer if you're late with delivering it, because they've got a robust schedule of lots of magazines to be printing. If you miss your printing slots, that's causing them a lot of problems. So you can be fined if you're late. So that's why your production schedule is crucial. So from that point, you then have to work out, right, all the steps of production, and you can imagine what they are. So that's writing the features, and that includes commissioning potentially freelancers to write some of them for you and giving them all a deadline to get that in. And then from that point, you've got to make sure you give enough time for it to be designed by the design team, for the picture team to source photos, and then for the sub-editing team to sub everything, make sure that all the grammar and everything is correct and the pictures are working, put captions on all the photos, everything like that, proofread the final version, design the cover. That takes ages. Normally you'll have like 3 or 4 covers mocked up and you're having a back and forth, everyone's talking about it. Sell all the advertising. That's all got to be in early, because you've got to see what the adverts look like next to the feature. You don't want some awful like contradiction or something, or even from a visual perspective, you don't want them to clash and look terrible because you've got orange next to red or whatever. So all of that stuff has a certain deadline. Every single one of those pieces I just said has its own deadline in the production schedule, and it's sort of like line by line. So
I was just gonna ask you, actually, could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between sort of the magazine, now I'm probably to get the right word here, would you say it's a magazine company or a magazine publisher, and then the advertisers, and what sort of level of control can you have to the advertisers? Can you say your advert doesn't match our style, can you change the font? Or is it completely that an advertiser would say, this is what our advert looks like and we want it to go in your July edition?
So probably something I should say is every magazine, every single one, has 2 main bits of planning, if you like, two documents ultimately. It's the production schedule that we just talked about, so line by line, the deadlines and the timelines for everything, and then alongside that is what's called the flat plan. And the reason I'm going to show you this, I've got a printout, look. Ta-da! So this is the layout with all the pages in pairs. And this is what's going on every single page of the issue. So this is the Bible of what on earth is happening on every page. Now, the reason this matters is everybody has this. The editorial team and the advertising team, you will sit at the start of the month. In fact, I mean, we'll do it months and months ahead, to be honest. But anyway, and you will map out exactly what's going on every page. And as you can see, we've got here, every single green page is an advert, right? And once you've sold it in, you write the advertiser's name in it, so you know who's got which page, right? So at the start, they'll be blank, and the ad team are given that, and they go, right, off you go, guys. You can now sell all these green pages, okay? Most of the time in each magazine, they stay the same. So they know they've always got the inside front cover, which is IFC, you acronymise this stuff, and the inside back cover, IBC. So they know they've always got those every issue. They know they've got page 3 every issue, so they can sell months ahead. You know, they can sell packages of them. So the reason this matters is you go to them and you go, right guys, go and sell all of that. Now what they can do at the same time is see what features these advert pages sit alongside and where they fit in the magazine. And this can mean that they can go, oh, hang on, right, we've got an advert next to a feature that you're doing on the top 10 best something or others. I know we should obviously now go and approach, you know, those guys, those companies, whoever they are, whatever the magazine is, and get them to advertise within that feature. So that's normally how it works. If you're doing it the right way, that's how it should work. So you should never really end up with a situation where an advertiser is either trying to put an advert in that you don't want, or is insisting on doing it in a month that you don't want. Normally, you're going to them and saying, this is our plan for the next issue or the next 5 issues. You know, you have these pages available if you want them. This is the rate card price for those. If you buy 3 in a month, you know, 3 in a row, we'll give you 10% off. You know, that kind of stuff is what the advertising team deal with.
Yeah.
You do have, though, a guide. So to answer your question fully, you have a guide that you give every advertiser of your magazine, and in there it has all of your editorial kind of philosophies and all the kind of do's and don'ts, and you can therefore articulate in that, if you want to be providing us with ad copy, it cannot ever say blah, 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 you know, and it has to definitely include da da da, right?
Yeah.
Now most of the time you won't be messing with what that advert has in terms of fonts or branding, whatever, because it's that advertiser's intellectual property. They'll be making it look like their brand, won't they? Of course they will.
Yeah.
So there are just a few do's and don'ts that you would have to make really clear before they give you the copy, and part of that is also saying you need to send it to us in this file format and blah blah, because you'd be amazed how many advertisers get that wrong consistently, and it takes forever to get the right kind of copy from them and so forth. So there's that. Would it help to now talk a bit about the relationship, like what the different departments are then in the magazine?
That would be really useful, actually, because yeah, we've got a lot of the idea of how it's put together. So maybe 2 things now, because I know you're very pushed for time, very busy.
Sorry, guys.
Worker. Just 2 really questions, I suppose, left from me. So yes, knowing about the different departments maybe within the magazine, and perhaps the relationship between, because I think you demonstrated there that one publisher or one company sometimes has more than one magazine. So you might be a writer for Vogue, but you might also be a writer within the same publisher for a different consumer. So there's that question. And then also maybe some idea about how you target your demographic, if you know anything about that.
Yeah, definitely I do. Right, okay, fantastic. How to deal with this, right? You see, I told you I could talk for hours about this stuff.
I'm loving the passion. I don't think our students would have ever thought about paperweight and glue being something that could be so enthusiastically explained. Thank you.
Oh, well, if you get it wrong, it can be a disaster, and all of your readers will hate the magazine and say, I'm never buying it again because it falls apart. So
yeah, well,
anyway,
right. And Vogue is all about promise of quality. So my students will recognise that as a phrase. So yeah,
and also you've got to have your advertisers happy too. They won't advertise in the magazine if it falls apart and it looks terrible either. Do you know what I mean? So they want to have their brand associated with quality as well. And don't forget, the advertising is ultimately what pays for the magazine to exist. And that is where you get difficult tension, which we'll touch on maybe briefly now, between editorial and advertising. Anyway, so the main departments are, as we've touched on, editorial. So in your editorial team, of course, you've got your editor or perhaps even editorial director. And then underneath them, you've got the features team. So you'll have a features editor and then a bunch of features writers. So the features editor kind of manages all that and makes sure that they're all doing their jobs. You'll have a news team, probably, if you have news in your magazine. So you'll have a news editor and then some reporters. You'll then potentially also have a contributing editor or 2, and you might have a commissioning editor. So contributing editors are basically freelancers, and your commissioning editor is the one who tells those guys what we need them to write. So one important thing to say is every magazine that exists employs people externally, freelance people, and they just pay them per article or per feature, because you cannot really have everybody in the office. It's not worth it really to do that. And more importantly, you can then pay experts. So if you're writing an article about fitness, you can pay a fitness expert who's the leading whatever in whatever, you know, the leading yoga expert or whatever, to write your feature for you. You don't have to employ them in your office, right? And you can just pay them for that feature. So you have a commissioning editor to do that, and that's so important. Then you'll have editorial assistants who help with a lot of the admin and stuff. So there's a big editorial team. part of the editorial team can also be sub-editors, as I mentioned before. Such an important role. They check the magazine basically hasn't got any errors in it, and that's a whole bunch of different errors we're talking, not just grammar errors, but layout errors and other things too. Sometimes those sub-editors and proofreaders also sit in the production team, but most of the time they're in the editorial team. So production team, these are the guys that care about all the stuff I was just talking about, making sure the schedule's running okay, flat plan's okay, they're updating the flat plan as it changes. I once had a magazine where one issue we had 32 versions of the flat plan. It had changed 32 times because we were moving features around and ads around. I think that's a record. Normally it's around about 5 to 10 changes, but you know, if there's a lot of changes happening and advertisers are pulling out and features are coming up too short or too long, you've got to move stuff around. So you make the decisions as an editor with your editorial team, but the production team are the guys that should make the changes and make sure it happens. And ultimately they're liaising with the printer all the time to keep them updated on any changes like thicker pages and all this other stuff. Then you've got your art and design team, sorry. So your design team obviously design all the pages, do all the layout. You might also have a picture editor or picture researchers in that team as well. So they're going out and getting all the pictures that you need for, you know, groovy front covers like this and everything else. So that's the art and design department. So that's like 3 now: editorial, production, art and design. Then obviously you've got advertising, big team, normally anyway, kind of the team that the editorial team have the most contact with. You guys are having a very, what should be healthy friction about what the magazine should be like. So you have an ad director, ad execs, you know, and various, possibly even like an insert sales manager selling the loose leaflets that you get inside inserts.
Oh, yes.
And then you might even have someone who's in charge of selling cover mounts, as I mentioned, so you can get like free things stuck on the front of the magazine. They're often paid for as well, so that's all part of advertising. And I'll come back to the advertising and editorial relationship in a second. Then you'll have marketing and circulation department. So you've got to have, sometimes they're separate, it depends how big the magazine is. You might have a circulation department and a marketing department, but normally they're together. The circulation manager, the assistant circulation manager, subscription managers, you know, they're worrying about making sure that all the different copies that we need to get out are going to the right places, basically, and all the stuff going to the news agencies going there in the right way, and they're on the phone all the time, talking about schedules and blah. Subscription manager, ditto, making sure the subscription database that you're keeping of everyone's names and addresses is working properly, and when everyone phones up to subscribe, that you've got a good process, you know, making sure they're getting the next issue, all that stuff, complicated stuff. So that's the marketing and circulation department. The marketing team mostly will be dealing with how you make people aware of your magazine in the first place, right? And so that will, in a weird way, be booking adverts, strangely, in places. So on the internet is a massive thing, right? You can pay Google to feature in lots of different searches. So if someone searches for, you know, home decor, that you can pay to have a little advert pop up for your interiors magazine, you know, that kind of stuff. So the internet has really blown that open, and most advertising for magazines, weirdly, is now online, which seems really counterintuitive, but it is. Or you advertise in other magazines within the same publishing company, which is what we're coming on to. So then your kind of last division or department will be the publishing department, and normally that publishing department is the parent company, and therefore, let's take Condé Nast, you know, you've got publishing directors and loads of guys who oversee how all the magazines within their business are performing. And when I say performing, how's the editorial content and quality? How's the circulation? Because we need that circulation to be up, because we need to have high circulation to be able to justify the amount of money that we charge our advertisers to advertise in the magazine, because they want to make sure it's being seen by thousands and thousands of people. So that stuff is all interrelated. That's the stuff the publishing team and the publishing director in particular is responsible for. So he's making sure that all the different teams are doing what they should be doing to maximize the potential for this magazine to do really well. And as I say, Condé Nast will have a big publishing department, and then underneath that there will be separate editorial and production teams for each of the different magazines, and potentially separate advertising teams, but sometimes actually that's a joint team. So you have one massive advertising team. So one guy can be selling adverts in 4 or 5 different magazines, because he doesn't necessarily need to be an expert on the editorial content. He doesn't have to be, you know, a lifestyle expert or whatever expert, because he's really just selling space in the magazine. It helps if he knows a bit about content, as we talked about, but you know, he doesn't have to be an expert. So they're your kind of different departments. The tension between editorial and advertising, as I say, should be a healthy friction. The editorial team should be keeping the advertising team accountable for selling good quality advertising, not weird rubbish stuff that doesn't match the brand of the magazine. the advertising team will often try to influence editorial, and that's where you need to have a strong editorial team that say, no, just because that advertiser's spending, you know, £100,000 on this advertising package does not mean we're going to write a really nice positive feature about them just for the sake of it, or that we're going to change the rankings that we've put in of what we think are the top 10 best whatever, just because this advertiser's spending money that month. Now, I wish it was that black and white. Often there is a bit of negotiation to be had, and it all comes down to communication. And one of the worst examples I can give you, and maybe this is something we should finish at, I don't know, but one of the worst examples that I've come across, a magazine before I joined it had a survey with their readers, asked all their readers who were investment bankers to rate in order their favourite stockbrokers, basically. So this is obviously a title that was in the city in London. You know, who are your favourite stockbrokers? And they compressed all the data together, blah, 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 and came up with, you know, this is what our readers say are the top 10 best stockbrokers in London, sort of thing. The editorial team hadn't kept the advertising team posted on how those results were coming in, and the advertising team sold, I think it was top 50 stockbrokers actually, they sold a massive sponsorship package for this whole magazine issue that had this feature in to the bottom ranked stockbroker out of the 50. So this stockbroker had spent thousands, I mean like nearly hundreds of thousands of pounds on sponsoring this issue, and they were bottom. So then the advertising team found this out. Now this tells you how awful the communication was, and this should never have happened, because they should have all been kept in the loop of how the results were looking as it went along. But they found out they were bottom, and then the advertising team came to the editorial team and said, is there any way you can make these guys not be bottom since they're spending hundreds of thousands of pounds? And we were, obviously I wasn't there, but the editorial team said, well no, because this is important to our integrity.
Yeah, that it's genuine.
That we genuinely, you know, do this the right way. And that's where brand and editorial integrity, you know, are so important. You can't start compromising that, because if you start with that and you start changing things and you start, then where does it end? And then in the end, your readers won't trust what you're writing as being the truth. And once you've lost your readers and you know, they no longer have respect for that title, you're going to lose your readership, and then you're going to lose your advertising as a result. So actually editorial integrity becomes one of the most important currencies to the success of your magazine. Everything stems from that.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. I can't believe that.
Talk so quickly. I'm sorry. I was just trying to cram in loads.
If it's any consolation to you, I think that my lessons sometimes feel like that to our students. So don't worry at all. And actually what we've got now, because thank you for agreeing for it to be recorded, this is something that we can use in our revision, and we'll maybe revisit the questions chunk by chunk. That's absolutely fantastic.
If there are any follow-up questions, I'm very happy to do a part 2. That would be fine too. So
okay. Well, I have your email address now as well. Thank you. So if there are questions, we might fire those at you between now and the Year 13's summer exam about magazines. That would be really handy.
Well, in the meantime,
thank
you everyone for listening, and best of luck obviously with those exams and the rest of your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so this is just me able to do a quick final thing. Obviously, when you watch this, if you were making notes, you can take some time now to think about any questions that you might want me to ask Mrs. Davis, and I can send those off in an email, and I'm sure we'll get those responded to before time is out, before the exam. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.